I think on balance, the benefits outweigh the costs, but it's a close call. Let's put it that way. I think that most Americans, and I certainly fall in this category, are proud of the work that our military does, not just to keep us safe, but around the world. I think the most recent example, of course, is what's happening in the Philippines. We see the U.S. Navy has just an enormous capacity for providing relief in great quantities and relatively quickly, and that's terrific. And I think it's a horrible tragedy, but we've seen how much good the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy can do. I also think, however, that even when the United States is going around and trying to do good things, sometimes it doesn't work out very well, frankly. And I think that too many people get caught up over whether or not we have good intentions. I think we do have good intentions, but the point is good intentions don't guarantee good results. And so I think generally when I approach U.S. foreign policy questions, I ask the question, what is the benefit? It should be a very clear benefit, and the cost should be manageable and determinative. You should have a good idea what they're going to cost, what the risks are, before we enter into a major undertaking. And I think that is one of the key differences, of course, between disaster relief and intervening in a foreign conflict, where, again, in the case of disaster relief, you're not fending off, adversaries who want desperately for you to leave, usually, generally speaking. And I think that's why disaster relief tends to be much more effective and successful than our recent efforts at kind of brokering civil conflict, which is very hard. Well, most of my cases that I look at are here in the United States, and I think if we go back really many years, not just in the recent past, but the United States has undergone some big boom periods in military spending, usually associated with wars, and then some pretty significant drawdowns. We're at the leading edge of a drawdown in the post-Iraq, Afghanistan environment, but we also experienced one, of course, most recently, before that, after the Cold War. And I looked at a lot of cases in the 90s, this being, Austin being one of them, where there was clearly excess base capacity, and a number of communities adapted very quickly to the closure of a base, and some, and I think especially here in Austin, did very, very well. But we also have cases of not a base closing per se, but of factories, companies retooling or going out of business. That also happens. And in a dynamic economy, eventually those resources will find their way to more productive uses. And I think as a general proposition that is true, although I recognize that in individual cases, sometimes it can be a long, drawn-out process. Well, two reasons, I think. Number one is because the negative implications are the ones that are most visible, and the long-term or even medium-term benefits of reallocating resources elsewhere tends to be kind of invisible, or at least obscured. The other factor I think that comes into play, especially when we're talking about closing of military facilities as opposed to the closing of a private factory, is that individual political figures, political leaders have a vested interest in shining the light on the jobs that they deliver to a community. And by the same token, saving those jobs is a very high priority for them. Arguably, it's one of their primary jobs, right, is to represent the interests of their constituents. But I think that we should shine at least as much light on those individuals who kind of have a bit more long-term vision and see, yes, there will be some dislocating effects and people will have to find new work, but the long-term benefits really do outweigh the short-term losses. And I think there have been a few instances where people really have kind of risen above the kind of short-term thinking, and I think we really should celebrate their example. That's a good question. It turns out to be somewhat cyclical. I think they are generally tied to the end of wars, but they also seem to go to about a 25-year or so period. So we saw a pretty substantial drawdown after the Korean War, obviously the most important drawdown after World War II. That was the biggest increase in military spending, so also the biggest decline. But you also had big drawdowns after Korea, after Vietnam, after the Cold War, and now in the early 2010s you start to see a drawdown. It's pretty modest, by the way. People don't realize that actual military spending is really flat in the aggregate, but especially when you talk about the base budget, when you take out the cost of the wars, there really hasn't been a huge drawdown. We're starting just now to see some reductions below the rate of inflation, for example. So I think we're still in the early stages of perhaps a longer and deeper drawdown, but one still not as deep as the one we saw after in the early 1990s, after the end of the Cold War. I think it can, in the sense that certain communities become heavily dependent upon a single source of revenue. Now, that's not unique, of course, to military spending. There are other instances where a particular company becomes the dominant player and they don't engender a lot of spin-off activity, and therefore, if that company suffers or if that industry suffers, there's not a lot else to pick up the slack. You know, the kind of classic obvious case is Detroit, which is a city that was so heavily dependent upon a single industry, not one company, but a single industry, and didn't have the diversified base that they could succeed quite well. What I've seen so far in looking at the closure of military bases around the country is that the extent to which a local community is diversified economically before the closure is announced and before the closure actually takes place will tell you a lot about how well and how quickly they can adapt. There are certain exceptions to that. There are also a few cases where a particular facility was managed by, mismanaged or poorly managed, or just sometimes people make kind of bad bets. They bet on a bad, a new tenant or something like that. So as a historian, I do try to pull out some best practices or some lessons learned from a broad set of cases. But as much as anything, I'm just trying to tell the stories, because I think understanding those stories at some level of detail can help people to understand the range of experiences that we've seen. And I do draw some cases from the late 19th and early 20th centuries actually too. This is an ongoing process, and we will expect to see a similar process in the future.